Physiology and personality. All right, so the most notable differences that are found with physiology um, and personality are those between extroverts and introverts. And remember that Isaac had already found that extroverts and introverts reacted very differently to caffeine. Okay, and that caffeine had a much stronger effect on introverts. Okay, and so extroverts can drink more of it. And this is, there are a lot of ways of studying this. Isaac started out, using blood pressure. Okay. There are a lot of ways of studying that kind of arousal. And let me give you another example. What is the galvanic skin response? Any of you know? I'm sure that some of you knew that that was basically sweating, right? So how much we perspire. And the thing is, there are very subtle differences that we can pick up with GBS measurements. When we measure that galvanic skin response. Okay, very subtle differences, but very reliable and can have very strong effects. So you may not feel, for instance, that your blood pressure, your arousal level has changed much as you've been watching these lecture segments, but actually it has, and you just didn't notice it. But we've got measurements that we can measure far more precisely than that. And the galvanic skin response is a really good example of how we can measure for sympathetic system, nervous system kind of activity. And the idea is, you tell me, is electricity going to travel the best, be conducted the best, travel the best in a wet environment or a dry environment? You're like, well, what? Of course. Yeah. So what they do with the galvanic skin response is they put an electrode, they glue one to one part of your palm. And then they will put another one a distance away from it. Okay. And then they will administer electricity into the first one and see how long it takes to reach the second one and how strong it is when it reaches there. Okay, that's what's being measured. And of course, if your palm gets a little more damp, a little more damp, a little more damp, it's going to travel a lot faster and a lot stronger. All right, so many researchers have come up with a lot of other effects too after eye zinc. So effects have been found for nicotine, very similar, in fact. So nicotine has a much stronger effect on introverts than extroverts, and what we see is that's one of the reasons why extroverts tend to be more likely to be smokers. Most extroverts are not. Most people are not smokers, but that's one of the reasons why. And then we see a difference with crowds. This is really cool because it points to general physiological thing about extroverts and introverts. The difference between them is that extroverts are more lively. So there's more energy with extroverts. There's more of a need for an energy output. So I talked about earlier in these lecture segments for the biological approach, when we talked about activity level, I said that there's always a few students in the front rows of a live classroom who wag their feet, right? And what's also interesting is if we measure foot waggers on extroversion, we find a larger percentage of them in the foot waggers group compared to the non-foot waggers group. But this idea with crowds is kind of based on that idea of energy, that extroverts are more lively, they have a higher energy output need. And this one's really cool, though. I want you to think about this. How many of you out there feel like you can study in the middle of a really busy, noisy, busy coffee shop? And you can study very well. Okay? And some of you are going, yeah, I can. And some of you are going, no way. Okay? And what we find is that extroverts can focus like that. even in a crazy crowded environment, they can focus. And they would actually rather study in that kind of environment than a really dead one like the library. And we find the opposite with introverts. They rather have that quiet and peace, no distractions around with the library. And so extroverts are less bothered by crowds in a lot of different situations, and that's one example. Introverts more bothered by crowds. And then we get to sensation seeking. Okay, extroverts are have far higher scores on sensation seeking, generally speaking, than introverts do. Sensation seeking, seeking out sensation. Okay, um, how might this be played out? Oh, infinite number of ways. We could never even think of them all. But, extroverts might want to try spicier food because they're seeking a sensation. They, in a lot of different ways. And I want you to think about how this could be connected also with smoking, with a smoking addiction. Sensation seeking. Maybe, some people smoke because they need something to do with their hands. That's kind of a combination of tactile sensation seeking and also this idea of activity level and needing a release of that activity. These things could play into an addiction for smoking, right? And if that's true, it's really important to know, like we've mentioned before, the different components of your addiction. Okay, so we talked about this with smoking and with Freud's oral personality, right? But the idea here is all of these things could play in, may or may not play into an addiction to smoking. And if you're addicted and you're trying to quit, it's really important to know what plays in so that you can set up, um, more functional things to take their place. You're far more likely to succeed when you try to quit. So with sensation seeking, if you think that, this activity of doing something with your hands and also the physical sensation of doing something with your hands is playing into your addiction, then you would want to come up with something more functional to do with your hands. It could be playing with beads, a string of beads. It could be knitting. It could be anything, right? That you can think of to do with your hands, more functional thing. Speaking of sensation seeking, this is a really interesting personality variable, and you measured yourself on this. So I want you to take out your SAS sheet, okay, your self-assessment sheet, and to take a look at your sensation seeking score, because we are now going to interpret that. Now, the possible range of scores that somebody could have on this sensation-seeking scale is 20 to 120. Very lowest being 20, the highest being 120. The range that we have received from ASU students who have taken this class, okay, several hundred of them in the past, has gone, very lowest has been 23, and the very highest has been 112. Okay, so that kind of helps you know where you are in there. And then probably most important of all is knowing the ASU student mean, which is 73. 73. Are you about around that mean? Are you much higher than that? Are you much lower than that? Hey, your sensation seeking. Let's go back to physiology and personality and take a look at this. Now when we look at extroverts, they do tend to report more positive mood. Okay, and that's interesting though, because does that necessarily mean they experience more positive mood? Not necessarily, but they think they do, right? All right. And then something that is not so good is that for extroversion is that extroverts sometimes have a tendency to act without thinking. In other words, they tend to be higher on impulsivity scores than introverts do. Okay. Not the best thing, but acting before thinking. And, okay, we also have some whoops, I think we missed focus. Let's go back here because this is important. We talked about the fact that extroverts can actually study in a really crowded place, like a crazy crowded coffee shop, even when there's music playing and such. And they have a tendency to be able to focus that stuff out and to focus in on what they are doing and not let that hurt them. In fact, what's really interesting is if you take somebody who's highly extroverted and you make them study in that library, it's not going to work very well, because what do you think will happen to an extrovert in that environment? Okay, they might fall asleep. They're going to get so sleepy, so unstimulated, okay, that they could fall asleep. So that background noise in the coffee shop, instead of being a distraction to them, actually helps them to be more focused. Okay. The opposite is true for introverts. They're going to focus so much better in the library, because if they get into the crazy coffee shop or bar scene, for instance, and are trying to do this, trying to study, all these other things are more of a distraction to them. Okay. All right. There's also some physiological studies on neuroticism. So we see extroversion, introversion coming out in these physiological ways a lot more. But with neuroticism, okay, what is found is that people who are high on neuroticism tend to be in a chronic state of activation. So when we measure that sympathetic nervous system activity, it could be the level of perspiration. Now, people really vary on how much they show that, but we can see differences. Again, just with the GBS, with blood pressure, with many different measures that measure this sympathetic nervous system. What we find is people who are high in neuroticism tend to be in kind of a state of activation all the time, higher than normal activation. Okay? All right, so this brings us to one of my favorite parts of this lecture, which is larks versus owls. So you remember, larks are what kind of people? Morning people, and owls are night people. Now, you may be neither, right? A lot of people are more towards the middle of the scale, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But we're going to talk about some real differences here. When we look between larks and owls, that's opposite ends of this scale, right? They're really far apart. And so we really see some significant differences. But do know that when you hear about this type of work, that some of it, what we covered today, for instance, is really valid. Some of it out there is pseudo-psychology, but some of it is really valid. We have scientific evidence for it. And this is driven by your circadian rhythms, okay? So there are a lot of physiological variations that follow your circadian rhythms, like your blood pressure changes at different times within your 24-hour cycle, and even your urine production varies depending on where you are in that cycle. It varies across that time. And the average circadian rhythm, so if you were left on your own without any cues of light, being dark out or light out, without any cues of alarm clock or anything, people would tend to run the averages somewhere between 24 and 25 hours. Okay? So for most of us, our alarm clock keeps us more on a 24-hour schedule. But we vary. And the most extreme that we found in variations in circadian rhythms, the most extremes ever found, is 16 hours for the lowest ever found of somebody being really healthy and on their own without any of those cues, following a 16-hour cycle. Okay? But the highest one ever found, is 50 hours. Okay? Most people, though, if they vary from that 24 to 25, only vary by about 2 hours. So almost everybody will fit in that group. So these extremes are really rare cases. They're really scattered out there. Almost everybody is around this midpoint. 2 hours, give or take. So you can be just 2 hours off and be a true lark or true owl. Okay. But the deal is, if you're a morning person, there's a real biological component to that. And that is that your circadian rhythms are shorter than normal, than the average. And if you're an owl, your circadian rhythms are longer than average. Now imagine that you're a lark and your rhythm ends 2 hours before your alarm goes off in the morning. And there you lay, wide awake, and the world is not up and running yet. You're like, why can't I go to the post office? Why can't I go to the bank? Nothing's open, right? Why can't I get anything done when I'm wide awake and I'm rearing to go? Now I want you to imagine the other experience, though. If you're a true owl and your circadian rhythm doesn't end until about 2 hours after your alarm clock goes off. I fit in this category, and so does my cat, Teosarian. It's so obvious. It's very cute. But when he first wakes up for a while, he's really like this. He can't even open his eyes all the way. He's squinting. It's very cute. Hey, but there's some real differences going on here. So when we look at research on differences, we also see it beyond this rhythm length, circadian rhythm length. But we see real differences in energy. So owls have a lot more energy later at night than they do in the morning. Their performance is better later at night. Now that doesn't mean that you have to take all night classes to do well in college if you're an owl, right? Or that you have to take all morning classes if you're a lark. And, good thing, because schedules just don't work out that way usually, right? Well, but here's the deal. If you take night classes, in-person night classes, then, you might, and you're a lark, a morning person, then you might need an energy drink to keep focused, or you might need to drink some coffee to keep focused, right? And that's true of owls if they are forced in a situation where they have to take early morning classes. You can still do just as well, but it's just going to take a little more effort on your part to be focused. Okay. Now, one of the most interesting studies is with compatibility, because this is huge, guys. This is really huge. Fortunately, most people are somewhere in the middle, aren't true larks or true owls, because that is rarely tested when people are deciding whether to be roommates. You don't usually test each other on this, but whether you will be compatible with somebody else as a roommate, this predicts it. You're both being the same, larks or owls, predicts it better than even the big five personality traits, any of the big five. Pretty powerful. Huh? Okay, well, knowing that, okay, makes us really sometimes curious on our own score. Are we true larks? Are we true owls? Because let me tell you an interesting fact about larks and owls. A 2005 National Sleep Foundation study found that 55% of people think that they are larks, that they are morning people. But in fact, very, very few of them really are. It's a much lower percentage who really are. So 41% that think that they are owls, and again, most of them are not really what we would call a true owl. Okay? And 4% of people think that they are in the middle. There's really no difference, and actually that number is much higher. So what you think you are may not be what you really are. Let's take a look at your larks versus owls versus hummingbird. What is that about? Score. Okay, so take out your SAS sheet, your self-assessment questionnaire sheet, okay, and you have filled out questionnaire 6 with your score, and you can write in that name column now, larks versus owls. Okay. And before we take a look at this, I want to introduce this term hummingbird, because that has been introduced into the research more recently. People who fall in the middle. So a lot of you are going to fall in the middle. You're not going to be true owls or true larks, okay? But you're going to fall somewhere in the middle, and that is now referred to as a hummingbird for a very good reason, because there's actually a good benefit of falling in the middle. You tend to be ready for action regardless of whether it's early or late. So and your performance level's pretty consistent across that way. Doesn't matter whether you take night or morning classes. And the reason that's called hummingbird is that hummingbirds are also ready for action regardless of whether it's early or late. So that's the bird for which your symbolism is lying. All right, how do we interpret your scores here? Hey, the possible range of scores goes from 16 to 86. From 16 to 86. And this is, instead of ASU, mean, which wouldn't tell you that much, is going to be interpreted in the context of categories. So research has shown these categories. Okay, to be a true lark, what is often called a super lark, okay? Your scores, if your score ranges between 70 and 86, you are a super lark. If you are a moderate lark, okay, 59 to 69. If you are a super hummingbird, you are 42 to 58. If you are a moderate owl, you are 31 to 41. And if you are a super owl, okay, that's 16 to 30. All right. Let's talk a little bit more about larks and owls now that we know whether we are a lark, an owl, or a hummingbird. Okay. So only a small percentage of Americans are really super lark or super owls. Most people land more in that hummingbird range, more in that, a moderate, range and hummingbird range. But some famous larks from the past include Benjamin Franklin, the Dalai Lama, and former President Bush. Both of them, in fact, both former presidents. And famous owls include President Clinton, President Obama, and a rapper by the name of Queen Latifah. Early to bed and early to rise. Remember that saying? Makes what? Makes a man healthy and wealthy and wise. Who said that? Anybody know out there? That was Benjamin Franklin. Okay? And is there any truth behind that? There certainly seems to be a stereotype that morning people are more motivated and that they're more achievement oriented. And in fact, we find no difference on those measures. So research shows that regardless of early to bed, early to rise, or late to bed and late to rise, there's no difference if you, in your, there's no correlation between those tendencies on your part and your physiological health, your physical health, or your psychological health. No differences, okay? But differences only arise in both groups, and they're really, really strong, significant differences, drains on your health, okay? Only in one condition, if you go against your grain. So, very important to go with what you are, a morning person, a night person, or a hummingbird. Now, actually, there's one thing that we found, one difference that has been found that is significant, okay, and that is that at handling, okay, shift changes and jet lag. There's one category of those three that is significantly better than the other two at handling shift changes and jet lag. And you might guess that to be hummingbird, and if you did, you guessed that incorrectly. Surprisingly, that is owls. Owls tend to handle shift changes and jet lag better than the other two groups. Okay, the last thing that we're going to cover today is the heritability quotients, how to compute them. And you need to know this, you need to know it before the test. So what I want you to do is first, we are going to want to write down this equation. Okay, heritability quotients in your book, when you ran across them, they were H. They were given as small lowercase h. Okay, H equals, and it's always point something, right? But how do you actually compute it? How do we know the heritability quotient, for instance, for smoking or for drinking or for extroversion or these different personality components, okay, or traits? And here's the formula for you here. So what you do is you take the, what does the lowercase r stand for? Everybody should have had this in Psych 101, prerequisite for this course, right? And so hopefully you all got this right, that stands for correlation coefficient. So first, whatever you're wanting to know the heritability quotient for, you need to compute the correlation component between monozygotic twins on the measure for that thing. And you need to compute it for dizygotic twins. And then you take the monozygotic twin and you subtract the dizygotic twin correlation from their correlation, and that resultant number, you times that by 2. That's simple, that easy, okay? I just want you to practice that once and make sure that you got it, so that you can feel confident of that for the first test. But do be sure to get that equation there in your head, okay? Because you're going to have to do this at least once for the test. All right. So what I'm going to do is give you the correlation coefficient for the monozygotic twins, and that is 0.50, okay? And the correlation coefficient for the fraternal twins is 0.23. So I want you to go ahead and pause this and compute this and come back and see if you have the right answer. Okay, so the first thing that you did hopefully was to subtract the 0.23 from the 0.50, and you got a 0.27. Okay, so that comes out to 0.27, and you simply times that by 2, and you've got 0.54. So our simple little run there, the answer is 0.54. Here's some interesting heritability quotients for you, really interesting. You might think that smoking is just something that people learn, that there would be no heritability quotient for that. But actually there is, okay? And the heritability quotient, again, we study that by looking at monozygotic and dizygotic twins that are raised apart, okay? And what we find is that the heritability quotient studies have all come up with, you know, a range of numbers. And so they're looking at many studies, but the very lowest one is still very significant at a 0.36, and the highest one is 0.56. So, you know, this is a pretty respectable heritability quotient as far as your vulnerability in becoming a smoker. It doesn't mean you can't kick it. You know, you can do anything you set your mind to, but we do vary in our vulnerability simply in genetics alone, okay? And if you think that that's strong, look at the one for becoming an alcoholic. Look at the heritability quotients. They vary from 0.50 to, look at that, 0.71. So even stronger than smoking. All right. So I need to remind you of your homework now. You have two more, the next two questionnaires that you're going to want to do before you start the lecture segments for the humanistic approach. Okay. And you also have a test coming up before that. So you're going to want to study for that test and take that test and make sure you have those two questionnaires done before you start the humanistic approach. And you're going to want to take those scores and fill them in on your SAS sheet and have the SAS sheet out before you start the humanistic approach lecture segments. All right, so good luck on your test.